Well, welcome everybody to episode 2 of the DRS Train podcast. I'm Peter Brook, the man who thinks Sebastian Vettel should be a 5-time champion, and I'm joined by Ciaron Smith, the man who thinks Kimi Raikkonen should be a 5-time champion, and Nav1, the man who thinks Fernando Alonso should be a 5-time champion. Welcome, guys.
Hi, how are you?
Very good, thank you.
Good to be here, guys. Looking forward to the discussion.
So obviously on this podcast we do race reviews, but the real bread and butter is the historical content. And so as our race preview for each upcoming race, we are going to talk about a historical race from that circuit or that Grand Prix. But as the next race is Qatar, and there is only one Qatar race before, and it wasn't particularly historical, we decided to expand that to a Middle Eastern race. And where better to start than the Duel in the Desert, the 2014 Bahrain Grand Prix.
Yes, so the 2014 Bahrain Grand Prix, definitely one of the most famous races of the V6 Turbo era and the 2010s generally. I remember when it happened, it caused a lot of attention, instantly drew the Prost-Senna comparisons due to the battle between Lewis and Nico. But of course, there was a lot going on before the race. There were protests going into the race. Back in 2013, there were calls that the race would be cancelled. Human rights organizations were basically boycotting the race. And of course, in 2011, the race had indeed been cancelled. So it was very much not a certainty that this classic race would even happen. Going into the race, Mercedes is dominating. Rosberg is leading the championship with 43 points. And yeah, just the start of a new era, really.
Yeah, start of a new era, and part of the interesting, let's say the interesting takeaway I had from this entire weekend was it very much encapsulated each team's status and how their season would go. You know, Mercedes would have an in-house duel between the two drivers. Ferrari were an absolute shambles the entire weekend, from free practice to the race. We'll get into that later. Williams tripping over themselves when they really didn't need to, and Red Bull fighting their way through the field. So, you know, we'll speak about this as we go on here. But yeah, it was a race that very much, I thought, just kind of encapsulated the dynamics of the 2014 season. But probably a memorable race for many reasons.
Yeah, and going into quali, the order wasn't clear actually, because in FP1, Alonso was second, Nico Hülkenberg was third. Obviously, FP1 is FP1, but it looked like the Ferraris would be more competitive than they were. Again, in FP2, I believe, Alonso was second. Kimi might have been the top 10 as well. So it looked like Ferrari, especially after the first two races where Alonso had finished fourth twice, was not that bad. And obviously, we would learn that they were. And yeah, going into quali, just looking back on what happened there, one of the big shocks was that Sebastian Vettel was knocked out in Q2 and qualified P11. Well, promoted to P10, but knocked out in Q2.
Yeah, I mean, this was the race, I suppose, where the hybrid era really kind of began, because this circuit revealed a lot about each team's true pace, and obviously the kind of meta, if you want to use a gaming term, was engine power for 2014. And this is something where Mercedes and all of their customer teams had a huge advantage at Bahrain because it's a big power circuit. And so that's where so Ferrari and Renault in particular, their engines were not so good for Red Bull, and it showed in the overall pace of the race and qualifying.
I would also point out that tire wear was very much emphasized in this race, and you know, a lot of chassis were also exposed. in this race. Certain teams dealing with tire wear much better than others. On top of the engine disparities that you referenced there. So in a way, it did give us a true picture of where everybody was for the first time in the hybrid era. Unfortunately for some teams, they were, they had a very sober realization after this race that they were going to be in for a miserable season. But yeah, I think one thing that I want to touch on at some point here is, exactly which teams it suffer and which didn't. But I want to first point out that before this weekend even started, we had a lot of different intra-team battles going on, intra-team duels going on, and whether it was the two Williams boys, Ricciardo versus Vettel was hotting up. I mean, Ricciardo really had already put some manners on Vettel in the previous races, and everybody was keen to see that. But I think for me, the biggest takeaway was Kimi versus Alonso this weekend, and it really all started because this was the first weekend Kimi got a new steering rack, and it immediately made a bit of a difference. It was still pretty much undrivable, as Kimi did suffer with the handling of the car all year, but he was actually able to drive at this point. And it was interesting to me that the entire weekend, Ferrari didn't realize that he had a cracked chassis from FP1, but he still managed to outqualify Alonso on Saturday. So, it got me a little excited because I thought, okay, well, this could be like the start of a resurgence here, but that was not to be. And then I think apart from that, it gave us a very good picture of Hamilton versus Rosberg, but we'll get to that later. And I don't want to jump the gun here, but I'll leave it at, with the Ferrari boys, there was a lot going on behind the scenes that weekend. And that's just something to consider here as we're going along, because there was a big debate about why Raikkonen was so slow that year, and this was the first weekend he really punched back, and he punched back first in qualifying. And we'll get to
Kimi that Saturday was just on it again, as you said. You could really see that he was just more confident on some onboards. Obviously, that Ferrari was never handling well, but he was just a bit less scared to drive it. It looked like he just really was uncomfortable for the first two races. It must be said that in Q3, what helped the fact Kimi outqualified Alonso is classic Alonso 2023 Q3 incident where his Q2 time is 0.3 better than his Q3 because he's not able to put in a good lap. This is something that you will hear in many race reviews, that many Alonso fans recognize it. Both me and loads of Spanish fans recognize that he has always had, not always, but especially nowadays, but even back then, a tendency to mess up his final Q3 lap. So that was what happened yet again. Daniel Ricciardo qualified third, which was, well, as Peter said, incredible because Mercedes engines had dominated this weekend outrageously. Like they had completely dominated the Bahrain track, and Daniel just put the car in P3 when, as I said, Vettel couldn't get out of Q2. Daniel had a penalty, so he was starting 13th. Going into the race, people were looking forward to that. Where would he end up finishing? He was very much the talk of the paddock at that point because, you come into a big team and you start outperforming your four-time world champion teammate. Down the grid as well, well, not down the grid, but just further back, Williams and Force India, as we said, Mercedes customer teams, they had a lot of teammate fights going on, as Ciaron highlighted. And yeah, this was a race where we saw everyone remembers it for the Duel of the Desert between Nico and Lewis. But there were a lot of duels between Bottas and Massa, between Perez and Hülkenberg. I think there were like 4 different overtakes.
Yep.
So yeah, let's just get started with the race then. What did you guys think of the start?
Yeah, I thought it was good. I mean, it was interesting, obviously, because Rosberg had pole. Hamilton possibly could have taken, he had to have bought his second lap, but Rosberg had 9/10 on Ricciardo, so that already gave away a lot of the pace that you'd expect. But obviously, he loses the lead to Hamilton at the start, and then he tried and failed to take it back at turn 4 by and was pushed wide, and then just kind of settled into a position.
Mm-hmm.
But behind them, they did their usual thing. It was kind of parallels to 2023 in that we had, in this case, 2 drivers kind of disappearing into the sunset rather than 1. And there was a lot going on behind because we had basically 5 teams battling it out as contenders, essentially, for 3rd place.
Yeah, but the thing is I want to touch on something you said. You just felt that when Hamilton got in front, Nico could do nothing about it a lot of the time. But yeah, like you said, Rosberg lost the lead at the start. Apologies, and then Massa had a rocket start. I mean, that was that's a contender for Felipe Massa's best ever start. I mean, the man went from 7th to, I mean, I'm pretty sure he went up to 3rd, didn't he?
Yeah.
I mean, that's unbelievable. And Kimi had an awful start. Fernando had a decent start, but it was really Felipe who. I think that was Felipe's best ever. I mean, unless somebody else can. Australia 2010.
I think Massa in Monza 2016 had an amazing start as well. I think, but yeah, this one was incredible. Must be said that he was only down in P7 because he had a snap of oversteer during his final Q3 lap. Otherwise, I'm sure he would have started 3rd or 4th.
Yeah, he underperformed in qualifying. There's no doubt about it.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think he'd obviously just perfectly locked up the whole starting phase. But yeah, with Hamilton Rosberg, I mean, there was very little. Hamilton's start was marginally better. He had the advantage that he was starting on the inside as well, so that made a huge difference in terms of getting position. But yeah, the main takeaway was, again, another Mercedes customer team having such a strong start at the beginning.
Must be said that everyone was starting on softs, apart from Vettel, who obviously back then, just as a reminder to a few listeners, you had to start, if you went into Q3, you had to start on the same tire you had qualified on. So you had no choice in what tire you would use to start the race. So if you qualified 11th or 12th, drivers would often go in on these fake optimistic interviews saying that they would at least be able to use brand new tires or go for alternate strategies. So Vettel was, I think, the only one of the main runners, or at least the top 15 to start on mediums. And it's quite important because it pays off a lot towards the end. So yeah, the start goes on. Mercedes just goes into the distance. Nothing really happens apart from some very good duels, actually, between Williams and Force India, which kind of dictates the race.
Well, I think Maldonado made contact, didn't he, as usual, with somebody. And I think it was one of the Toro Rosso cars.
Yes, Jean-Éric Vergne.
I think he hit Verne. I mean, what a job that must have been to be Maldonado's mechanic or part of his mechanic team that year. I mean, it was just shocking. I mean, how many times he made even minor contact. It's not easy to fix these things. I know it sounds like
Vergne after the contact said he tried to kill me, which it's not a kind of comment you just make on the team radio usually, and Vergne wasn't one to just jump on the radio. So yeah, Maldonado in that race made contact. 3 times, I think, and the third time, obviously, that famous crush with Esteban Gutierrez.
Yep. And yeah, I think what was interesting was as that race kind of progressed, yeah, the Mercedes cars were in a class of one, both in terms of tire wear and also in terms of their engine grunt. But then we started to see some changes. We started to see the Ferraris drop through the field because they immediately started burning into their tires. And, we had some cutaway shots to Luca Di Montezemolo looking at Domenicali like, Domenicali was never going to see the light of day again. It was awful to watch that. And then the Williams boys also had some issues. So I was surprised at how, not just the Force Indias were passing cars left, right, and center, but how, some of the cars like the McLaren didn't look too shabby either. So, it showed that, like, even if you had the best power unit like Williams did, you needed the tire wear with those very unpredictable Pirellis that year to go with it if you wanted to maintain position. And Williams still had had some work to do on that front. So that was interesting to see. Kind of the Williams and the Ferraris drop back.
You were talking about Williams. I just want to point out lap 10, Bottas loses place to Button and Hülkenberg. As you said, McLaren was a bit better than what we thought at that race. And Bottas, I think, again, we knew, I think he was a big talent going into 2014, and this was the season where he would deliver. But you could already see glimpses of his fabled unaggressivity, his reluctance to really fight in battles. Because, I mean, it's the third race of the season. You are in your second, I think, season in F1. You have a very good car, good teammate who's a famous name, but also, as we all know, is not that fast. Sorry to the Brazilian listeners. So it's really your chance to shine. And he did shine across the season. But on that lap 10, he just lets Button and Hülkenberg go through against cars that, Williams could have defended against. It just wasn't a good showing for me.
Yeah, very fair. Bottas, I mean, did we know he was a talent? That's the problem that Mika Hakkinen and Kimi Räikkönen did. They overstated the talent pool in Finland. And Ron Dennis fell for it. And I think we also fell for it with Valtteri. I mean, Valtteri is a quick driver. But, just like Heike, is he really a true racer? I don't think so. I mean, like you said, his racecraft has always been extremely tame. And, I think in his defense, the Williams did have some tire management issues, some tire wear issues in this race. And, this race also makes me think, like in the early stages before we move on, that McLaren was flying. So it also makes me think, how quick was the 2014 McLaren? I mean, in some races, that thing looked like it was quite good. So, that's something to this day I wonder about. I mean, was that car really as bad as people made it out to be if he was able to, pass Williams with that kind of ease? Ricciardo did the same thing. I mean, Ricciardo did that. I think he passed Magnussen, and then I think Hülkenberg, like you said, passed Bottas. But it was interesting to see. I mean, I still wonder about the pecking order of the cars that year, and races like this just make it more confusing in a way.
And the pecking order was influenced a lot by the tire strategy. The Pirellis was so inconsistent. Bottas pits on lap 10,
Garbage tire,
whereas Nico Rosberg pits on lap 21 on the same tire.
Right.
I don't think it was helped, obviously, because again, this was the first night race at Bahrain, so that was going even more into the unknown, because then that wreaks havoc with the temperatures, and that affects, again, as we see in Abu Dhabi, it means that FP1 an FP3 are essentially pointless because those are run in the day, in the blazing hot sun.
Yeah.
But it's
very good point. I think that probably that just probably exacerbated the problems the teams with bad tire wear had. It's probably why Williams and Ferrari had to resort to plan B, if you will, and go to a 3-stop strategy in that race, while everybody else was on 2 stops, I believe. So.
But if you look at the general pecking order, because obviously we've seen that it's the Mercedes teams that are stronger, but then you've got Ferrari and Red Bull who are in contention, and those are both teams that put emphasis on aero that year, which obviously wasn't the way to go, because I mean Mercedes, obviously the aero was still perfectly good, it could have been better, but it was the engine that really made them so dominant. And you had those two fighting against basically 4 Mercedes teams. But then in the rear half, it was all Ferrari and Renault customer teams with chassis that also weren't that good. And so you get this, you kind of get the field split into 3 sections of Mercedes, and then all the people fighting over third place, and then all the backmarkers who are running Ferrari and Renault engines.
Yeah, I think I agree with all of that. But without sounding like I have, my tinfoil hat on and like a conspiracy theorist, Mercedes had an emphasis on the engine, but I mean, we now know that they had years of preparation and they had years of advantage in development that the other teams simply had not taken advantage of or had initiated. So I mean, in the other teams,
the famous tire test. I think you could mention.
It wasn't just, the famous tire test, but then, Niki Lauda came out. There's a very famous article, and he had told De Montezemolo that Mercedes had been working on their hybrid engines and the hybrid technology since 2007. And that basically the fact that Luca De Montezemolo, because Ferrari have ultimate veto power, had effectively been tricked by Mercedes into agreeing to the hybrid rules. De Montezemolo had the power to veto these rules and delay them. He accepted them thinking that Mercedes and Ferrari would have effectively a duopoly over the rest of the teams in engine power. He was utterly wrong. The only thing Ferrari had was, they didn't have anything at all. They just had a pull rod suspension. So, I mean, at the end of the day, it was a disastrous move for Ferrari. They overestimated themselves, and they totally underestimated the, I would call, unfair advantage Mercedes had. I once tweeted at the Mercedes admin exactly what I just told you, and the Mercedes admin responded back to me on one of my accounts on Twitter and said, "Wink, wink. That's what smart people do. Ha ha ha." And then deleted the tweet after. I'm putting it out there. Wow. I'm sure somebody has a snippet of this. But at the end of the day...
When was that?
This was about 5 or 6 years ago. I was just so fed up with the state of Formula One. Just went on ranting at the Mercedes admin, stop bragging about having 6 years advantage over everybody else. But, I think Red Bull did an especially impressive job because their chassis was not that far off Mercedes, in my opinion.
Oh, for sure.
But they,
for sure. With the Renault engine they were competing. They gave a car that Daniel could, perform in.
No, exactly. So, anyways, I think bottom line is, Mercedes had a huge advantage, and I'd agree with the way you characterized that. It was a bit of a free for all for that third place, wasn't it? Force India, McLaren, Ferrari, Williams, just going at it. But then, what else happened then? After that.
Well, the advantage you talked about. Well, everyone pits, and during the pit stop shuffle, the advantage you talked about gives us one of the best battles. I would say in the 2010s, the famous duel starts on lap 18.
It's funny that because in we see Mercedes on the first lap, and then for the rest of the first stint, they're showing us everyone battling for third, and then suddenly they switch to Rosberg having a go at Lewis on lap 18. You're like, oh yeah, Mercedes, because by this point they were like 15 or 20 seconds ahead of everyone already.
Yeah.
Just off doing their own thing. But he did. It was sort of vaguely similar to the lap one. In that obviously this time it was Rosberg trying to pass Lewis, but then Lewis gets back past him again at turn 4. And it's kind of similar to Bahrain 22 in that Max would pass, he'd pass Leclerc there, but then obviously this time they had DRS on the run to turn 4, which they didn't in 2014, and Leclerc would just repass him again, playing kind of DRS chicken. But this time it was because, I mean, in this particular one, Rosberg braked very late, and so he basically went past Lewis and then turned in quite late, and so Lewis just had a far better exit out of turn 1.
Yeah,
I mean,
I think
it's hard to make a duel sound nice, but it's that easy with this one because, it was just riveting to witness, especially as 2013 last 10 or so races, nothing had happened for P1.
Okay. I respect. Okay, so I respect everything that's being said here.
Yeah.
But I'm gonna just like say one thing. Like, what happened at the beginning of the race? Rosberg tried to come at Hamilton and failed. What happened on lap 18? Rosberg tried to come at Hamilton and failed. And what did that mean? That meant that Lewis had the opportunity to pit first, didn't he?
That changed the race. Yeah.
And that changed the race. But, you know, that was a recurring theme for Nico Rosberg's career. And I don't want to. I want to speak about this at the end because I have a very different take on this race than probably anybody else. Because, you know, at some point you've got to make a move stick on your teammate. Like, do something. Like, it was just at that time the rivalry was too early to say that it was going to be a recurring theme. But this race, I understand why everyone thought it was so exciting. I was a little depressed after this race because I saw, and I'm kind of jumping to the end here, so I'll leave some of this for the end, but I saw a driver who, even when the strategy was in his favor, could not beat his teammate in a wheel-to-wheel duel. And if he was the only challenger to that other driver, we were in for some seriously predictable racing. And that's kind of what we got. You know, like, you can say it's exciting, but at the end of the day, it was only Nico versus Lewis. I can guarantee you if a Fernando Alonso, even an on-form Kimi Räikkönen, you know, Seb, you know, who else? Daniel Ricciardo, they would not have been, you know, pushed off like that and what was effectively 3 or 4 different parts of the race. Nico had an opportunity to come at Lewis and couldn't make it stick. And the worst part about it for me was that Nico had a huge tire advantage at the end. You see, there's a difference, in my opinion, between a great duel and then someone underperforming and making it look like a great duel. It's a bit like saying, oh yeah, let's put Max Chilton in, no disrespect to Max Chilton, but let's put Max Chilton in the 97 Williams, and, you know, at a race Williams should lap the field, he'll have a race-long duel with Michael. The point I'm trying to make is that, in my view, in my cynical view, Nico Rosberg should have passed Lewis Hamilton. That was unacceptable. You have the softer tire. You've already gone at him twice before in the race. You know how he's defending. You know how the car is handling. I was depressed after this race because I thought to myself, oh my God, if you can't even pass Lewis with a soft tire advantage like that, when are you ever going to pass him? And he never did. I don't remember a single instance of Nico making a move stick on Lewis in a crucial race-winning situation. He tried in Austria, didn't he, 2 years later? How'd that go?
Honestly, I think we could just skip
Anyways,
the mid part of the race and come back to the mid part of the race later, because I mean, might as well talk about those two duels at the same time. And yeah, that's also what stuck with me when watching as as a young fan back then. I remember the commentators making it clear that Nico would have softs for that last stint. And I'm just gonna check now. I think it was new softs as well, which makes it, yes, new softs, brand new softs, um, against Hamilton's brand new mediums. That's, well, when the race started, it was said that there could be a 2 second differential between the two tires. Turned out there wasn't, but there was definitely still, I would say, a few good tenths of differential. That plus DRS, there's no way he should not have gone past Lewis after 3 laps. I fully agree on that point. Of course, it was great to witness, and a lot of the points you said, well, we know with hindsight. At that moment, we thought it would be the first episode of a real battle. I thought it would be, and it just it was just not very understandable for me how he didn't just send it a good little dive bomb and just go into the distance.
Yeah, because in the first stint, obviously this at this point they were both on the same tyre, and across that stint, Rosberg had been the faster driver. Whether that was because he was just trying to push Lewis more to get the lead back, or if he was just faster because Lewis was wanting to stave tyres, which is what most people do in opening stints. But the interesting thing as well is that at this time they used to show how much fuel they had used up at each point. And in the first stint, Mercedes used less than everyone else, even though they were still like a second a lap faster and having a go at each other. It was just such a huge advantage. But I think Rosberg had basically, he tried at the first lap, first couple, and realized, okay, I can't pass him, so got himself out of DRS range, but then was it very easy to get himself back in that near the end of the stint. And this would have compromised both him and Lewis in terms of tyre saving, because it meant they were both pushing each other harder than they probably wanted to.
Well, I'm not sure if that's because Nico understood that, but he was the only one, with Daniel Ricciardo, to go for the alternate strategy, which was not 2-stop or 3-stop, but soft, medium, soft. They were the only two drivers to do that. I'm wondering if Nico didn't do that just for his second stint to just be focusing on himself. And actually, during that second stint, as you said, he was lapping well. He was impressing on those mediums because, those mediums were meant to be the annoying compound of the weekend. They were meant to be the compound that was 2 seconds slower. And he was doing the job, but for some reason, that third stint on the softs just didn't work at all for him. And at the same time, Lewis was having a 22-lap stint on softs, which is also extremely impressive. And on fuel percentages, I had forgotten that they put the fuel used on as a graphic, and they kept just putting it back every 2 or 3 laps, a bit like we see with AWS predictions nowadays. It's like they had found a new toy and they had to show us. And obviously, in the end, it didn't matter because we had 5 laps of safety car.
Yeah, I mean, Rosberg had the fastest lap of the race near the end of the race, so he had the pace. Rosberg had the faster car. Hamilton had the wider one. So, I mean, ultimately, I don't really know. Yeah, I don't look at that as a great duel. I look at that as, wow, if Fernando Alonso or somebody else was in that Mercedes, that race would have been over. Because in the final stint, I mean, somebody would have made that pass. I'm sure Kimi would have made that pass. I'm sure Daniel Ricciardo would have gone for it. And I think this is the thing. I mean, if you're like, people think that, Nico Rosberg, this and that, like, Nico Rosberg had a dream ticket for 4 years. He basically was in a car that was a second a lap quicker than any other car. And even if he had a bad race, he would still finish second. So, he was in a position where he could challenge Lewis. And sometimes he did come out on top, but very rarely was that because of a wheel-to-wheel duel. And to me, that's a huge part of racing. I mean, that's to me the difference between a very good driver and a quick driver and a great driver. You need to be able to race wheel-to-wheel. I mean, that's what it comes down to. Like, can you pass another driver when you need to do it? And I don't know. It was to me, it was just absurd to see somebody with such a tire advantage just continuously get stifled. And then people started like praising both drivers after, and I don't know what on earth was going on there. So it comes down to racecraft. It comes down to racecraft. He had the speed, and Nico's always had the speed, but he doesn't have the racecraft, in my opinion.
Most of his advantage in races where he did win, it was qualifying, because he won the qualifying battle in 2014 and again in 2016, I believe. So he's kind of got one up, at least if you compare him to Bottas against Hamilton, because Bottas was very, very close to Hamilton on qualifying pace, didn't that often actually beat him, whereas Rosberg did relatively frequently actually beat him, and that meant he was at least ahead when the race started. And you could battle harder with him, but it's, again, when you look at the rivalry, is that across the 3 years, there aren't actually that many races where they were having close wheel-to-wheel racing.
Exactly.
But I think, again, the reason this was so popular is because it was very clean, and we'd seen hardly any racing. In 2013, it was Multi-21 was pretty much the only time we saw any that kind of battle. And then we have this, and obviously because the team have let them race, and they said, I mean, at the end, they kind of just rather critically said, just bring the cars home. So they didn't outright say, no, you can't pass. They just keep it clean. And they managed to. And obviously, I think that's what people like, because we've seen, Max and Hamilton. It wasn't quite so clean with them in their battles.
No, it wasn't. But Nico and Lewis had their moments. I think Austria 2016 was pathetic. I mean, I don't know what that was. And then the Spa incident was a bit unnecessary. Spain 2016 was just, I don't even know what to say about that. I mean, that was embarrassing.
A literal car crash, I think.
Yeah, I mean, that was really Lewis's fault, to be honest. To Nico's credit, he did make a great move. Lewis drove it was just pathetic. I mean, I've never seen a teammate crash that was so unnecessary.
I think they said that Rosberg was in the wrong engine mode or something, which was how Lewis caught up to him so quickly.
Yeah, but still, I mean, Lewis drove onto the grass. It's like, what are you doing? I mean, it doesn't matter. Like, Ben, back off. Why are you turning right onto the grass with such aggression? I mean, that's really... Lewis said, didn't he, that he felt like retiring after that race. Anyways, not to get off topic, but yeah.
Yeah.
Well, you Peter, you were mentioning the differences between Rosberg and Bottas. I think another big difference was that Nico Rosberg was good on starts, or at least decent, whereas Bottas, he had that famous jump start, but other than that, he was often prone to not leading into lap 1. Nico, very fast qualifier, and often, at least for the first few laps, was ahead.
So one thing I want to touch on, though, and I agree with that assessment, is if you look at the final standings of this race, it's almost like flying formation. You got 2 Mercedes, you got the 2 Force Indias, a Red Bull splitting them, the Red Bull after that, 2 Williams, 2 Ferraris. It's shocking to me that Ferrari probably wouldn't have scored points with both cars had the McLarens not broken down. And that leads me to Fernando Alonso's hand gesture when he crossed the line in that race. And many people have forgotten he did this, but it was a big deal in the Italian media. He cheered. He put his arm up as he crossed the line and fist pumped as if he had won the race. And I think people need to realize that, that was absolutely I thought, a classless move. Now, part of this was also because he had beaten Kimi, and it goes back to a radio message Alonso had made in free practice, and the radio message went like this. It said, he crossed the line after free practice 2 or 3 and said, all I want to know is, what is my advantage over him? What is my advantage over the savior of the country? And that was a sarcastic jibe at Kimi. Then Kimi put him in his place and outqualified him by 6/10. Then Kimi lost to him in the race because he had a horrible start and had some handling imbalances. So it kind of showed that, like, not only was the Ferrari car a mess, the culture and the relationship between Fernando and the team was not rosy at all. If he felt the need to send a message like that by sarcastically cheering as he crossed the line, I thought that was classless. But, a lot of people liked that. They said, oh, look, he's making fun of Ferrari. But, I don't think that was acceptable. And to be honest, I'm not sure Ferrari would have scored points. I'm not sure what you guys think if Button and Magnussen hadn't retired.
I mean, when has the relationship between Alonso and his team ever been good?
Right.
Like, that's kind of what's that's become what he's notorious for ever since basically 2007, when he started getting beaten again.
Yeah.
Is that now? Yeah, he if things aren't going his way, he just takes it out on the team, and even if it is their fault, it's not very constructive, and it doesn't help the environment. It just makes things worse. And at this point, obviously, this is his 5th season with Ferrari. He'd spent 4 years being beaten by Vettel, probably thinking he was owed 2 extra championships, which could have gone to him quite easily and didn't.
And another thing is, I definitely agree with Cameron is, when Alonso has a very complicated relationship with the media. That's something that isn't even debatable. But he hates when he feels that the media doesn't give him something back, or that the media even tries to depart from him. A bit like when you have a group of friends in primary school and one of them goes against the dynamic. Because even this year with Antonio Lobato, the Spanish journalist and TV presenter, who's his famous, I'm not sure how to put it, just he's the biggest fanboy in the world of Alonso. And there was an issue with DAZN TV, D-A-Z-N, I'm not even sure how you say it, where they, I'm not sure they criticized, or they noted something that Alonso had done in a race. Austria, I'm not sure. But they said that he wasn't happy with what had happened. Alonso didn't look happy. Obviously, someone told Alonso that they said that. And for Alonso, DSN is his goat. They should be his goat. Because we are in Spain, that's the Spanish production. They should be praising him. And they had said he wasn't happy. And he then went on the weirdest of rows with DZN, where he, on the next interview, he just kept saying, no, I am very happy, like 4 times or 3 times. And it was just petty. Honestly, even with 2023 Alonso, obviously all of his fans are happy with the performance. But at that moment, even Spanish fans were like, he doesn't need to do that. DSN have been so happy for him all year. De La Rosa and Lobato have been praising him all year. One little remark, and he starts being sarcastic again. And it just felt the same with what Kyron said at this race, when he feels that a media or a country's media that should, emphasis on should be praising him, like the Italian media after what he thinks were the miracles he did at Ferrari for 4 years. When he sees that Kimi, who is the last champion of Ferrari, is being praised again for his comeback, it just doesn't sit well with him. For him, he should be the center of attention. Perhaps fairly so in some moments, but at that moment it was just petty. And for me, yeah, again, as an Alonso fan, there are some things he does where you just facepalm a lot.
Yeah, can't really disagree. I don't disagree with too much there. He really is just the most hyper competitive athlete that maybe I've ever seen, and I really mean that. The man is totally obsessed with beating his teammate to the point that I feel that Alonso doesn't even. Alonso really is the definition of if we're 19th and 20th, as long as I'm 19th, I'm happy. I really believe that. Like yes, he got angry.
I mean, at McLaren 2018, that's what
McLaren
was happening, and he
2018,
was. So,
I mean, at the end of the day, like he is very much just. I hate using this word, but cannibalistic. I mean, Raikkonen had an amazing quote for once. Not saying he has many amazing quotes, but for once he had an amazing quote at the end of 2014, and I think there's respect there between those two drivers. It's not that they've always had tension in their careers between Raikkonen and Alonso, but they asked Kimi what was it like having Alonso as a teammate, and there's a famous quote, and Kimi says, "It's no good when you have teams within teams."
yeah.
And that is a you see, again, like, Kimi, the deadpan monosyllabic, never says anything interesting. That's probably the most interesting thing I've ever heard a teammate say about Alonso, because it's basically implicitly confirming that this guy had squads inside of the team that worked for him. He split the team. That's what he does. He bribes his own, not bribe, but he incentivizes. I take that back. He doesn't bribe. He incentivizes his mechanics.
Good.
By giving, it's a big. I don't want to say untrue things. He financially incentivizes his mechanics by giving them a portion of his bonus, which I think is extremely unethical for many reasons. He absolutely demands to have preferential treatment whenever he can. And Kimi, implied that there was the quote that I read implied that there was a team within a team, and that always ends up backfiring. You need to be united. You need to be cohesive. You can't have factions within the team. Then you're going to see corporate disintegration. You're going to see different parts of the team clashing with each other, and that's not how teams win. Look at Mercedes. Look at Red Bull now. Look at McLaren when they were winning. I mean, that's a bad example, but look at McLaren with Mika and DC, not with Senna Prost. That's different. But in general, you usually have cohesive, professional units within the team that work with each other. If you try and split the team in two, it usually just ends up backfiring.
Well, my view, which is the other side, is I think both statements you said are true, but do not have to be linked. I do know that he always has given rewards to his mechanics, but again, that's not something that we know for sure, because other people claim that it's to the entire team, or at least at Alpine, just to the entire team. Obviously, at McLaren, there were not many rewards to give.
Oh no, I didn't. I don't think that's true.
Well, what I've seen is that at Alpine and Aston, he's always just rewarded the team, and on the other point, the team within team aspect, that one I fully agree. I mean, Fisichella also truly in his Beyond the Fisichella and truly both of them in their Beyond the Grid podcasts a few years ago said it. One of them, they were both praising him a lot for obvious reasons, but they were always saying, look, he's always done that. He was 23 years old and he was doing that. Now, it's good that you haven't said bribe, because I do see that word get thrown around. I think that's strong, and I'm sure you agree. But yeah, I also do know that, for example, Kimi also rewarded his mechanics. So how would you assess that?
I don't think it's the same thing. I mean, going on trips with mechanics once a year is different than giving money to some mechanics. And then by what that does is it makes the mechanics of the other driver a bit depressed. And
Was Kimi's rewards always non-monetary? That's just a real question.
Yeah, I don't think Kimi was a guy that, apart from his McLaren stint, really engaged in that kind of behavior. I think Alonso is the one that's notorious for, I'm going to split my bonus with my mechanics, and then that's also going to help attract the best mechanics from the other side of the garage who would say, hey, I'd rather work for the driver who gives me some of his bonus on top of the salary and bonuses I'm already getting. You know, it's a strategic call by Alonso to get the team to rally around him. It also ends up splitting a team completely and creating a horrible environment.
Well, let's bring the parent into this, Peter. What do you think?
I was going to make a small aside just on that. Last night I was watching a video on YouTube. It was a 2-hour segment that Speed did as a run up to the 2007 United States Grand Prix Indianapolis, where they basically set up like a fan zone, and they got each team on, and they would get the two drivers up on the stage with them, and they would just chat to them for 10 minutes about how the season was going. The only drivers that came on separately were Lewis and Fernando. Everyone else came on as teammates, and those two went on alone.
When was that?
Indianapolis 2007.
Oh, yeah.
So just after Hamilton won his first race. Yeah.
There's Alonso. If you remember in the race, Martin Brundle made a comment, and he said Fernando's emotions are not quite under control, both in and out of the cockpit. You can go back and watch the race, and you'll see Martin say that during that race. And I've actually watched that segment you're talking about on Speed. I know exactly what you're talking about, and tensions at McLaren were already extremely high at that point. And you only have to see Alonso's reaction in that race to see how frustrated he was, how irritated he was that he wasn't getting the number one status that he thought he was going to get. I mean, if you remember during that weekend, he just drove. He started weaving on the straight and drove to the pit wall, putting his hand up in the air, saying, "What are you doing?" All counterproductive behavior and totally unprofessional. So it doesn't surprise me at all that Alonso and Hamilton came on separately for that, because the tensions were already very high. And Alonso, in my opinion, was a bit out of control.
But yeah, so to bring this back to Bahrain,
all right,
a couple of quick points I want to make. This is a different thing. If we look a bit just about the middle stint, early stint, if we look a bit further back on the grid, because we haven't talked so much about the teams at the back, I have to talk about them because, of course, it's Caterham and Marussia. They had surprisingly good pace in the first stint, at least keeping up with Sauber. And then we saw that collision. There was the first major one. It was Bianchi with one of the Saubers that got them
Sutil, wasn't it?
It was with Sutil. Bianchi got himself a puncture, which basically wrecked his race and wrecked Sutil's. And then on the Sauber note, of course, the main thing that led us into that gave us the safety car was that collision with Maldonado and Gutierrez, which was, haven't seen something like that in quite a long time. A car flip over like that at such low speed as well.
Yeah, that was a scary accident, but what do you expect from Pastor Maldonado? I mean, he was a liability out there, wasn't he? He was spinning drivers around. He was literally making them topple over. It's just one of many incidents. There's not much else to say about it. I mean, I think in the case of Gutierrez, frankly speaking, it was amazing that he actually rolled over a few times in the air and then landed back on the track safely. It was good advertisement for the safety of the F1 cars, I thought. And if you remember, Gutierrez didn't get out of his car right away. So it was not a minor incident, even if it happened at slow speed. There was some concern that because he wasn't getting out of the car, he may have been injured or something like that. So, those kind of accidents where the car is flipping around like that, those are extremely dangerous. So
Just for your spine, just for your spine, it's dangerous. You just land in a car flat down. It's not a good experience at all.
I mean, he kind of landed on the wheels. Right, so he kind of they kind because he kind of landed at an angle, the wheels took the hit, and so that's where they all kind of crumbled up. So because if he'd landed just dead on the floor of the car, that could have done him a lot of damage. But he was obviously completely blindsided because he just turned into the corner normally. Because I guess you wouldn't. The braking zone is different when you're coming out of the pit lane, and I guess he thought, okay, I'm racing him, so if I get past him now, like if I don't get past him, I may not be able to get past him again. But also just Maldonado having no self-awareness, really.
But again, Maldonado in that position, yes, I get the argument that you're racing someone coming out of the pits, you try to get past, but in for that like hairpin, I would describe turn 1 in Bahrain as a bit of a hairpin in some way. There's no way you can try to outbrake someone if you're next to them, because you would have to assume that the other guy just goes completely offline to let you go. And you might have cold tires. I mean, you have cold tires and they might be slippery. So it was just so nonsensical. And it was for what, P14, 15? It was for me, it was one of the heights of Maldonado's nonsensical moves.
Yeah. Barcelona 2012, that kept him going for another 3 years. But he just got worse and worse after that. So,
well, at least it gave us that last safety car phase that gave us the Mercedes battle, as we said, but also it gave us a final pit stop round for the 3 stoppers, which you would have thought, especially with how F1 goes now, that if you get a free pit stop at the end, that puts all of the cars on that final pit stop in a very good position. 2 of the cars who had pitted just before this incident were the Red Bulls, who benefited greatly because, yes, they had to do 22 and 23 laps on softs, well, effectively 17 and 18 laps on the softs due to the safety car, but they managed to hold on to P4 and P6. So Daniel Ricciardo had gone from P13 to P4 just through very good strategy and good tire management. And Williams had gotten effectively a free pit stop. So you would have expected them to fight with Force India as they did all race, which was fantastic. We didn't mention it enough, but the fight for P3 between Perez, Hülkenberg, Massa and Bottas was really entertaining. But they had to put mediums on because of the mandatory tire compound, and they just didn't find the pace to even get close to the Red Bulls. And the last thing I thought didn't make sense at all was Ferrari. They also got not a free pit stop, but they got a pit stop on the safety car at the very end due to the incident, and they both put medium. So at that point, Alonso and Raikkonen had just done 2 stints on mediums, and they chose mediums again. Now, I'm not sure why they did that. Maybe they did not have any more softs for the weekend. Maybe the listeners know better than I do. But on paper, it makes no sense. And Kimi's mediums were used as well. So, yeah.
The big reveal, of course, once the restart happened, was that now Mercedes, it was one of the few points in 2014 where they actually showed their true pace, because they didn't need to worry about saving fuel anymore. Rosberg wanted to go for the win, and on the first lap they gained 4 seconds on Perez, and that included Rosberg having a go at Hamilton at the beginning.
Absurd, absolutely absurd.
Yeah, I mean it leveled out. It was about 2.5 to 3 seconds per lap after that, but that included them battling. Whereas Hülkenberg tried it on Checo at the restart, but otherwise Checo was just driving on his own with the others behind him, so he was running clean, and they were still gaining like 3 seconds on him.
It's funny you mentioned that. It's funny you mentioned that because I saw a screenshot of that moment where you just see Lewis and Nico at the end of the straight with the entire pack not having passed the start-finish line. after one lap, and some people had tried to make it look like that was lap 2 of the Bahrain Grand Prix, just to say that Verstappen's domination was justified. Obviously, that was edited, but yeah, it was unreal. But there was a race for P3, which was entertaining, I think. And Perez had a very good race at the time where we thought, well, we all knew that he was good in the midfield, but that was, again, one of those races where he just picked up P3 when it was up for grabs.
Yeah. Yeah, he did. And Hulkenberg made some mistakes, didn't he, in that race? So probably a combination of a great car and Hulkenberg making some unforced driving errors. What was interesting was Ricciardo put manners on Vettel in this race, didn't he? I mean, passed Vettel at the start, passed him again in the final few laps. So, really a sign of things to come for that season. I mean, Seb really didn't have an answer to Daniel in that race. So, Ricciardo did a great job in that race, you have to say, given that he really carved his way through the field.
Yeah,
there were a lot of teammate battles in that race.
Yeah, we hadn't. It was the first time we'd seen a proper comparison with them, because at the first race, Vettel's engine blew a few laps in, and then Ricciardo didn't finish in Malaysia, and Vettel came third. And this time, they got to both run a full race distance against one another. And I remember even Vettel was saying that they hope maybe by Monaco they'll be on par with Mercedes, and it's like, yeah, that's not going to happen.
Right. Maybe by Monaco 2018, but not by that year.
I was going to close the race with a big news that happened at the end of the race. Max Chilton finishing P13 with all the incidents and putting them back ahead of Caterham in the championship at that point, which was massive. Obviously, we know that Marussia would get P9 in Monaco eventually, but I have to mention this battle because we have Peter among us, and he is the resident 2010s backmarker expert.
So as I said before, the pace was relatively good in that compared to the years before, there wasn't such an obvious drop-off to the field because they were still relatively close to Sauber, but that was more because Sauber were just abominably bad in 2014. But between the two teams, it was quite close. Bianchi was ahead, but then he just kind of wrecked his own race with that puncture. Kobayashi in the final stint, I've forgotten exactly, but there was some kind of drop in power or some kind of issue because he lost 30 seconds to Chilton in 10 laps. So something went wrong with his car, but then again, that's not new because this was, it was a waste of a year to put someone like Kobayashi in the Caterham. And Maldonado, of course, he got a stop-go penalty for his collision with Gutierrez, which put him behind Chilton as well. But even so, Chilton, in the final stint, he lost 16 seconds to Grosjean. But they just had nothing by that point.
The problem with that Caterham is the longer the circuit was, the slower it went. Anyways, bad joke. But I think the point is that it's a shame. Kobayashi is probably I don't really rate him at the level of the elite drivers. He was certainly better than the group of drivers he was forced to race for most of the Grand Prix that year, as a product of his car. So you're right; it was a bit of a waste to put Kobayashi in that seat, but nevertheless, those points are very important. So it's not an insignificant result by any means. But it's hard for me to really give credit to Chilton because we know that he wasn't really a very talented driver. So you can be consistent all you want, but at the end of the day, I think it wasn't something that I remember was really heralded too much at the time. So
what I find interesting with Max Chilton is he's now obviously one of the driving forces behind the McMurtry Spearling, which is the fastest car on Goodwood ever now, and I think that was just a nice resurgence from him because, as you said, his F1 career was nowhere really. Yeah,
No, no, he was. He really was not. Yeah, I think Max Chilton was. Was he a pay driver? I mean, how did he get that seat in the first place?
I think almost everyone was a pay driver if they weren't in a junior academy.
Right.
With those teams.
So,
well, it's interesting you mentioned we mentioned Chilton. Let's do this again. Well, it's interesting we mentioned Chilton because I believe that he's one of the drivers that we will be ranking in the next segment of our show. So, in the DRS Train podcast, we don't only look at race reviews, we also do a segment that's called the DRS Rankings, where all three of us rank a driver, a circuit, a car, and something else, which I cannot remember now. So those get chosen by the producer, and yeah,
Well, the other thing we rank is the race itself.
good point. What is your ranking for the race?
I mean, I can start off and say that that race was heralded by the media afterwards, in my opinion, in the most ridiculous way. I mean, I saw some people saying like, "Oh, the rebirth of Formula One." I mean, they have no shame. I mean, it's just like, what exactly was reborn? 4 seconds a lap advantage? I don't really understand. Nico Rosberg, showing his utterly average racecraft. I mean, I wasn't that thrilled at all after the race. 7 out of 10. Nothing higher than that, in my opinion. But that's me.
What about you, Peter?
Well, okay. Well, first of all, we have to do its top 3 drivers of the race, the flop, and then the race itself. Top 3 drivers for me. I think. I guess. Well, Lewis for winning it, not from pole and holding off Rosberg after several attempts to pass him. Checo for getting that third, and I think Ricciardo as well, just for being so competitive in a car that shouldn't really have been good there.
Sorry, did you say Hamilton, Ricardo, Perez?
Yeah, my top 3 for the race.
In that order?
No, not in that order. Just the top 3. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, I agree with that top 3. I would rank it as Hamilton, Ricardo, and then Perez. Literally 1, 2, 3, like that.
It's really hard to argue against those 3. Yeah. You know what? I think Jenson Button, he was having a very good race as well, and I think I'm just gonna go off.
Sure.
Yeah, but I can't really remove anyone from the top 3.
That's a good choice. Jensen was carving through the field, and that's why I said like that car looked quick in Jensen's hand.
I cannot remove any of the 3 I mentioned, but Jensen, yeah, as Karen said, just very good in that race. Had an issue which I forgot what happened to his car, but had to retire.
Oh, he had a clutch issue. He had to retire.
Yeah.
So, but if both McLarens hadn't retired, there's a possibility that Ferrari would not have scored points in that race, which is pathetic. I think Massa did a good job to hold off Bottas. Obviously, his start laid the foundations for that. And I think at the end of the day, Massa did a good job. But come on, are we really going to say that Massa and Bottas did a better job than the top 3? I don't think so. I mean, not only was the Williams tire management not great, but you felt with the car that the Williams was that it was very difficult to know if Massa and Bottas were getting the most out of it. And we saw Massa battling Vettel wheel to wheel in that race. So the Williams had the speed to beat the Red Bull, or at least one Red Bull. Massa just couldn't get it done. That's always been Massa's weakness too, in my view. He's not great wheel to wheel, as far as I'm concerned.
Actually, going into the flop of the race section, I'm just gonna go ahead and say Bottas because yes, Maldonado was the idiot of the race, but it wasn't really a flop if we think of how flop means what you expect and doesn't happen. Bottas in that race just disappointed me a lot because you just talked about Massa having a race where he was up there fighting with the Force Indias for a good while. Bottas wasn't aggressive, finished behind Massa, obviously, after Massa's better start. And yeah, for me, flop was Valtteri Bottas. He's a driver I like, but not in that race.
I'm going to pick Jules Bianchi as the flop.
Yeah,
because obviously he was a driver held in very high regard and was normally working wonders in that car, but just not in this race.
I'm gonna take it completely. The flop is Maldonado, and then Bianchi, like you said. Bottas was also quite weak relative to maybe what we expected, but I'm going to take a different path here, and I'm going to say Nico Rosberg was the flop of the race. Because, again, you're in a car that is, seconds quicker than the rest. So finishing second is not an achievement, okay? That's the bare minimum in that car, honestly. So then, why I see the flop? Well, the flop designation comes from the fact that he had an utterly colossal tire advantage in the final stint, tried every book in the move, and couldn't really make a dent in Lewis Hamilton's defense. And I just think that's ridiculous. Like, it's not that he had a few tenths. This was a major tire advantage he had. And he had already had a chance to mentally get a picture of Lewis, both at the start and in the early stint of the race where he tried to pass him again. It's a bit unacceptable to me that he just couldn't win that race. And it's not that I'm a fan of Nico or a fan of Lewis. I'm quite neutral to those two drivers. It's not that I really favor one over the other. Obviously, I think Lewis is a slightly better driver, but Nico is also a good driver. But I always felt like his racecraft was so much weaker than it needed to be. And that race was just, to me, the failure of Nico Rosberg rather than the success of Lewis Hamilton. And that's why I say Nico was the flop.
Yeah, for the ranking for the race itself, I think for me, it was perfectly good from an entertainment perspective, with lots of battles going on, and there was a safety car. I'll give it 4 out of 5 stars because, again, this was at that point it was by far the best Bahrain Grand Prix we'd seen, and that's an interesting trend. Is that ever since it became a night race, it has started delivering actually fairly good races, whereas all the ones before that there's not much to take from them in terms of entertainment
2006 was a
value.
mega race. 2006 was a proper race.
That was the battle with Schumacher and Alonso for the lead.
Battle with Schumacher, Alonso, Kimi 22nd to 3rd. It was a good race. Was it more exciting than 14? Yeah, it's tough to say. I don't know.
How many stars would you give it then?
If we're out of 5, I'm gonna give that 3.5 out of 5. If I can do that.
Okay. Well, I'll try to be the positive one, but go on.
Yeah, like I said, because I thought the drama at the end shouldn't have been drama. I mean, that should have been a routine pass from Nico Rosberg and put that race away. So, is that enjoyable? Yeah, to a neutral, but if somebody really appreciates good driving, I think they sit there and think, well, why on earth couldn't you make that pass? which is how I felt, and I felt quite sad after the race because I thought, well, that's that then. Lewis has got this in the bag. I really thought that after that race. So,
dare I mention Abu Dhabi 21? There's an example of a driver on newer, faster tyres passing someone on slower, older tyres and making it stick.
yeah, no, and that's exactly what I'm getting at. Yeah, I mean, that's a good thought experiment. Put a 2021 Max Verstappen in that Mercedes, in that where Nico Rosberg was, in Nico Rosberg's seat in the final stint of Bahrain 2014. I'd like to bet I would put
That's
a
a
lot of
very
money
good
down.
one.
I put a lot of money down that Hamilton is missing a side pod, and Verstappen wins by 5 seconds. You know,
Or
And
Checo
it's-
That's a
wins.
very good one.
or Checo.
Or Checo wins. I think Checo would have
Yeah.
picked up the scraps.
I think the two options, if he'd been his teammate in 2014, would be either Verstappen is champion or Ricardo is champion.
That's funny. Yeah.
That could have worked.
I mean,
well,
that's possible. Actually, I'm not even. Yeah. Oh, that would have been awesome. Imagine if they had done that at Monaco or something. Yeah, you're right. That would have been good.
well, my ranking of the race trying to be a bit more positive because I was younger when I watched, and I also know that many people absolutely loved that race. I'm going to give it a 4.5 star rating because I agree with everything Ivan said on what the battle meant. I also thought that Nico should have cleared Lewis. But again, in terms of battles for the lead, we were famished in F1 for a few months. So at that point, I didn't care. I wanted to see a battle and just a narrative around it. Hamilton and Nico, good friends, Mercedes dominating. It just made sense for me. And even apart from the Merc duel, I said it a few times here, but I loved the Force India Williams battle. I loved how Red Bulls had to go past Kimi, then Alonso. I think there was a lot going on in that race. The pit stop battles, the different strategies, 2 stops, 3 stops. Some had 4 stops as well. So yeah, I would give it 4.5. Yeah.
All right. I mean, yeah, you could look at it that way. At the end of the day, I like to see drivers make the most out of their equipment. And if there's ever a race where a driver does not do that, I feel like I've been robbed. And I was one of the few people that was a little like depressed after that race because I just knew that race had shown us a glimpse of the future. And it was not a utopian future. It was a dystopian world where one driver wins, the other one also manages to challenge occasionally, and one team just destroys every other team for effectively the next 8 years. So it was, I can't really say that it's one of my favorite races because it also had some very controversial moments. I thought Alonso's cheer was just so arrogant. It just bothered me so much that he felt the need to rub that into Kimi's face like that. Totally uncalled for and classless. And then I think some of the driving standards in that race were just shocking. And Hulkenberg making errors, Maldonado running into things. Not sure what Bianchi was doing. I mean, he really did look like a rookie, didn't he? So, you know, these are things that, on a very subjective level, of course, I don't like to see in races. I like to think of myself as a 1950s elitist. I like excellence. I like great driving. I like drivers doing, even if it's a quote unquote boring race, if it's an excellently boring race, I'm satisfied as a viewer. And that was not an excellently driven race by many people. So that's why I give it a slightly lower rating. But I really do respect the other view here. I get where you're coming from.
Indeed. So for the final segment, we have the DRS rankings, where we should be ranking a driver, a car, and a circuit. And so to keep it relevant to this episode, the driver is Max Chilton, the circuit layout is current Bahrain, and the F1 car is the Sauber C33 from 2014 itself.
I'll let one of you guys start on this one.
Okay, so Max Chilton. So this was his second of 2 years spent just with Marussia. The main standout from 2013 in particular was that he finished every race, and I believe he may have been the first rookie driver to do that, or at least he has them. He holds the record for most consecutive race finishes from the beginning of his career, even though he was beaten by Bianchi in almost every race, and that continued again in 2014. He didn't have, he didn't have many particularly bad moments. He crashed out Monza 2013, I think it was. But otherwise, he was just slow. Was the thing. Yeah. Like he couldn't keep up with Bianchi at all. But he at least kept himself out of trouble and had a car that worked reasonably well.
So you bring up an interesting point, because he was slow. But he was smart enough to realize that if he's slow and brings the car home, it's better than being slow and running into things and costing the team even more money. And I think that's what saves him from the F tier. I place him firmly in the D tier, because this was a driver who was way off his teammate. This wasn't even a little bit. This was colossal deficits. He wouldn't have been hired by any other team on the grid. He really was a bad driver in Formula One. I think, he went to IndyCar, did his thing there. He was never an excellent Formula One driver by any stretch of the imagination, and came across as very robotic in his PR. I remember Webber rolling his eyes in one press conference when Chilton started talking. He was very much a mediocre pay driver who was smart enough to realize that bringing the car home is a better way to get re-signed potentially than being reckless and crashing it everywhere. I mean, we saw Mick Schumacher get fired because of that. So if Chilton was somebody who was that slow but was also crashing all the time, he'd be an F driver. But I give him credit. The fact that he was somewhat aware enough to know to bring the car home, and he had finished every single race, I'll give him. I place him in the D tier. I put him in D.
I think his motto was "slow and steady doesn't win the race." It was basically his one.
There's the tortoise and the hare, and then there's Chilton. No. So,
well, you two have hit all the points I wanted to make, all of them, which is that he was unimpressive. He was not fast. He was just chilling at the back. And that's exactly why he should be in the D tier, because he was chilling at the back, not crashing at the back. He was just doing his thing. And I always think, who are we to judge him if he's in an F1 car and he's lapping around, getting lapped twice? Or the Marussia got lapped on lap 14 or 15, I think, in the race. So he's just getting lapped by Hamilton and Rosberg and whoever. He's not crushing. And the point Ciaron raised about Mick is so important to me. If you're driving a backmarker, all you can do, apart from trying to beat your teammate, but it's a bit hard when your teammate is one of the supposedly generational Ferrari poster boys, just chill, do your thing, race and don't crush. And he did that perfectly. That rookie completed race record that Peter mentioned as well. It's impressive. I think it's really impressive to just do that in a Gatorham and just keep lapping. So yeah, solid D-tier driver. Didn't do much wrong. Didn't cause controversy as well. Yeah.
Yeah, and I'll say D as well if I hadn't said before. So then the circuit is Bahrain in its current form. So this we've had this one. It hasn't been modified. Well, actually, it was modified in 2005. They made some small changes to Turn 4, but otherwise, there's the endurance layout, which was run once, and then we've had the outer sprint layout, if you want to call it, used in 2020. But yeah, as circuits go, I mean, it's good in that it's quite varied because it has a mixture of high and low speed corners and long straights. It generally demands a lot of power. It's not particularly easy on the brakes either. So it offers kind of good challenges. And aesthetically, it's quite unique being in the middle of the desert like that. Yeah, it's not a bad circuit, but it's not massively iconic at the same time.
Yeah, I echo those thoughts. I think Bahrain tried to improve the circuit for overtaking purposes. I really liked the initial layout. Some people thought it was too long and twisty at the beginning, but it was challenging. You saw lockups, you saw people making mistakes. So I did like the original layout, but I'm just not a fan of these Tilke circuits. There's no payback. It just feels like the braking zones are the size of a parking lot, and everything is just medium speed, or apart from Sepang, I mean the circuits just don't thrill you, in my opinion, and there's always just constant understeer in these corners, and the harder you attack them, it seems like the less reward you get. So I mean, we've had some good races, but I look at the Bahrain circuit as an average circuit. I'm not somebody that cares too much where we go race, but I do care about the quality of the circuit. And, I know there are a lot of F1 fans that think Bahrain is the best thing since sliced bread. I'm not sure what kind of bread they've been having, frankly. So, it's an average circuit for me. I'll be kind. I'll put it in the B tier.
It's quite kind of jagged, and if you compare it to a lot of circuits from, say, like the 1950s, it has those circuits had a very organic feel because a lot of them were just built on public roads. But it was also a case of less is more, because a lot of them, they had hardly any corners, and the corners they did have were very high speed, very smooth ones. Exactly. And it had this just natural inbuilt flow to it. And this kind of circuit, and a lot of the other ones Tilke has done, don't have that, because he has this obsession with doing massive long straights and then really tight hairpins at the end, or having sort of concentric corners that gradually tighten or something like that.
Exactly.
Well, again,
that's exactly it. And there's no payback. It does not reward the driver who really wants to be committed into the corner. You just kind of have to live with the understeer and kind of just make your way around the corner. These aren't tracks that are testing, who can go through Eau Rouge flat, or who can keep the throttle down in Arabata 1 and 2 in Mugello. And that's what racing is about. It's about that, Mansell going around the outside of Berger at Peraltada. It's not about, who can rotate a car with understeer in a medium speed corner that everybody is bored to death watching. I mean, it just doesn't reward the driver for attacking the corner harder. And I find that to be incredibly boring. And you're right.
Well, again,
back to Tilke designs. Yeah, go ahead.
Again, I'm going to be the devil's advocate, kind of how I think I will be as the young representative, as someone who basically sees a lot of what people say about the track nowadays. I really like this track, but well, I fully agree with most of what you said. That, for example, it's too forgiving. Turn one, for example, it could have been so much better if it was less forgiving, but they wanted it to be so safe that. Correct me if I'm wrong. There's never been a crash there. I don't think so. Well, apart from Gutierrez and Maldonado, there hasn't been a dive bomb in there, right?
You mean like turn one?
At turn one?
Yeah, yeah.
There has been.
There almost was an 06. Massa almost wiped out Alonso.
Yes.
Yeah.
Hamilton rear-ended Alonso in 08 coming out of turn 3.
Yeah. But not in turn one, which
Turn 1,
I think in turn one, you just look at the track, as I'm just looking at it on the slideshows. I hope the viewers are as well. And you're like, how has there not been a major incident there? I'm not calling for one, but it should be a big overtaking opportunity, which leads into something, especially because
at race starts, you'd think there'd be more. Oh, there was 2021 Vettel hit Ocon at turn 1.
Yes. Okay. Yeah.
But otherwise, it's similar to La Source in that it's a major choke point at the start of a race, but it just hasn't.
And I think the turn 1, 2, 3 complex is just quite nice, and it's unfortunate that there hasn't been much there other than the pinnacle of racing for some, which is driver 2 dive bombs driver 1. Driver 1 does a switchback and then is through on by turn 3. I mean, that's not the pinnacle of racing. You kind of know what happens when driver 2 sends it down the inside. I like the complex of turns 5, 6, 7. I think it was well implemented. And turn 10 might be one of the hardest corners in the world. I'm not sure where you guys stand on that, but turn 10, the braking on a
is that the downhill off camber?
Yes,
downhill. In the games, it's a giant pain in the arse.
Yes,
turn 10. Yeah. You can see how because it's a corner where you're forced to turn and brake at the same time, which is not something that F1 cars like doing at high speed. They're always going to lock up there.
I think it's a great test when a driver doesn't lock there. It's well done for an entire race, that is. So. And another thing, it's not about the layout, just the venue as well. It holds a special spot for me as one of the most accessible races to go to. It's not that expensive. It's very well organized from what I know recently. That's just a side point because it's not about the layout. But for me, I can see why many people like it. Again, not as much as like Ivan said, some people think it's the holy grail of F1 and it's one of the best tracks on the calendar. But I would put it as a low A. I know that you guys would disagree, but I quite like the circuit. I think it has nice turns. And since it became a night race, it's quite entertaining.
Yeah. I respect that a lot. And we're all going to have different views on this, but I do have to probably leave this episode a little bit early. So I'll quickly just give my thoughts on the Sauber and say that I have no idea where the 2014 Sauber was. I think it was one of the worst cars. The question to me was exactly how bad was it? I think it was better than the Caterham and the Marussia, but not anything better than that. So I'll put it in the D category, and I'll leave it at that. So
thank you for being with us for this episode too, and
yeah. Likewise. Good chat, guys. I will. I'll catch up with everyone later. And pleasure to be on the second episode here of DRS Train podcast. So I'll see you guys later.
See you around.
So, Peter, the backmarker expert again, what did you think of the Sauber? Because it did not score any points, I think.
No, it should have.
And that's impressive. During that era, to be a car that's not, your Caterham, Marussia, Manor, whatever, to not score a point. I think it was just incredibly unimpressive.
Yeah. So basically, this car, it was better than Caterham and Marussia, but it had worse drivers. That was the problem. So you had... It should have been fast enough at least one point. I mean, the major race was Monaco because Gutierrez was running in the points, but then he clipped the wall at... is it Raskas? Is it the penultimate corner? I get them mixed up. That's not... Yeah, Raskas is the penultimate corner.
Yes.
He clipped the wall there and wrecked the suspension. And then that ends up being the race where Bianchi gets 2 points. But the rest of the year, yeah, it was kind of... There weren't that... They finished 11th a few times and just didn't get lucky with attrition. And they had races like this where I suppose in this race they wouldn't have scored points if they'd finished, but they needed races with attrition where they were the ones not finishing. Well, they weren't the ones not finishing. Double negative.
Well, were they ever among the properly slowest cars, like Ineos, Caterhams and Marussias?
No, there weren't any races I can think of where they were like genuinely outqualified and beaten by them. There were races where they were maybe relatively close to them, such as this race, where I think in quali they were only a few tenths ahead, so not a huge amount. It's not like it would have been 2 years earlier where they would have been like a whole second ahead. But no, there weren't any races where, say, they qualified on the back row because they just weren't fast enough.
And they never made Q3 either, right?
If they did, only once, probably once
Yeah.
or twice at the most. I think it's highly unlikely that they would have. I can't remember off the top of my head, but I think it's highly unlikely they would have made Q3. So generally, they would have been filling the position of sort of what Toro Rosso was a few years earlier, of basically being like the slowest midfielders and the ones you would expect to be eliminated in Q1, as well as Caterham and Marussia. So yeah, it wasn't a well-built car. I mean, before this, the two cars before had been perfectly good midfielders, and they'd had much more invigorating driver lineups with Checo, Kobayashi, and Hülkenberg and everyone. And it was just an ugly car. They had a particularly offensive nose on theirs. Yeah, it's burdened by the drivers not being so good. I think D, like what Ciaron said, is probably reasonable, because they should have done. It should have been better than it was, but it could have been worse at the same time.
Yeah, I was just checking some of the results over the year, and yes, Sutil got 2 P11s. They were often in that P12, P13, but not often. Actually, just 4 times did they finish ahead of above P13, which is just not good enough. That's not. You can't just be hoping on other cars just retiring. I think it was a D, because F will have some atrocious additions for sure. But it's the fact I cannot remember a single moment from 2014 other than Gutierrez being launched by Maldonado with the Sauber. It was just nowhere.
Of course, the other main against the crash would be Sutil and Suzuka, which ended up triggering Bianchi's fatal accident.
Of course, yeah.
Other than that, and then Gutierrez crashing at Monaco, there's not much to say because they didn't do anything else.
Fully agree.
Yeah, so with that done, I think that brings this episode to a close then. So Yeah, it was a good chat. We covered a lot in just under 2 hours. It's been.
And of course, episode 3 will be releasing next week on the upcoming race.
Yeah, well, we're more than, unless something really goes wrong with Red Bull, we're more than likely to see Max Verstappen crowned champion for the 3rd time, possibly even on Saturday.
Yes, quite major. I looked up quickly if it had happened before that a champion was crowned, well, not on a Sunday, and it hasn't. So we could be in for a first.
There had been some, I think some people had made mentions apparently of a few others. Someone had mentioned South Africa 81, I wasn't sure. And then I think even it almost happened Japan 87 when Mansell had his crash in quali and was then basically put out of the couldn't race for the rest of the season. But I don't think it had mathematically happened at that point. So that should be an interesting one to discuss going back to Qatar. Okay, so thank you to Ciaron for joining us, and thank you as well to Nav.
Thank you very much.
And we'll see you all next week for Qatar. Bye, guys.